momento muito especial da Mostra, que vamos ter uma aula magna com o professor Kobena Mercer. Kobena é professor de História da Arte e Estudos Afro-Americanos da Universidade de Yale, nos Estados Unidos. E antes da... Vocês não querem dar uma... Ele vai ter um negócio para ouvir em português? Depois a gente... Ok. E a gente, antes dessa aula magna que ele vai fazer agora, a gente programou o filme O Projeto Stuart Hall, e de alguma forma era para tentar produzir um diálogo com a palestra que ele vai dar aqui agora. O Kobena Mercer é um dos mais renomados discípulos do Stuart Hall no campo da história da arte, e ele colaborou por muitos anos com Hall e inclusive editou o livro mais recente do Hall, que acabou de ser lançado em setembro, com escritos inéditos do Hall, que se chama The Fateful Triangle, Race, Ethnicity, Nation. Saiu pela Harvard University Press. E o Kobena é autor de uma série de livros, artigos, resenhas. Entre os livros dele eu destaco Travel and Sea, Black Diaspora Art Practices since the 1980s, Welcome to the Jungle, New Positions on Black Visual Culture, on Black Cultural Studies, e Exiles, Diasporas and Strangers, de 2008, entre muitos outros livros. Kobena Mercer é um dos mais renomados especialistas nas artes da diáspora africana no mundo de língua inglesa, né? Os seus escritos constituem contribuições críticas incontornáveis para mapear a emergência de vários artistas negros, como John Akomfrah, que surgiram nos anos 80 e redefiniram a paisagem do cinema e da arte contemporânea. A fala dele aqui hoje é intitulada Uma Introdução a John Akomfrah, Estéticas de Vanguarda e os Dilemas Pós-Coloniais. Eu gostaria, por favor, uma salva de palmas para receber o Kobena Mercer.
Well, good evening. I'm delighted to be here on my second evening in Sao Paulo, and honoured to be part of this retrospective of John Akomfrah in Brazil. So, born in Accra, the capital of Ghana, in the same year that the former colony became independent in 1957, John Akomfrah grew up in London from the late 1960s onward. With a background of living between two cultures, Akomfrah's cinematic vision gives us unique insights into the experience of diaspora, where identities are shaped by border-crossing migrations between two or more cultures. The body of work that he's created over more than 30 years, since he began filmmaking in the early 1980s, is in fact relevant to all societies that are grappling with the legacies of colonial histories that dispersed people of African descent all around the globe. So for these reasons, the importance of John Akomfrah's first retrospective in Brazil cannot be overemphasized. As he invites his audience to reflect on shared histories of race and ethnicity, Akomfrah gives us a fresh point of view by experimenting in every one of his works with the properties of sound and image that are specific to the cinematic medium. As a critic and scholar who has had the good fortune to have known Akomfrah for over 30 years, I am honoured to add my voice to this retrospective. And seeing Akomfrah's work in many different platforms, from essay films and television documentaries to multi-screen gallery installations, gives us the opportunity to see that for this artist, experimental montage was never a matter of style. Avant-garde aesthetics for John Akomfrah is always a matter of investigating the role of the moving image in mediating our experience of social reality. This matters not only so that we may better understand the conflicts of the past that inform the present, but also because what's at stake in challenging perceptions of our post-colonial predicaments today is the possibility that art and cinema may contribute in their own way to social transformation by making new futures thinkable. So we have the first slide. Akomfrah founded Black Audio Film Collective in 1982, along with 6 other students at Portsmouth Polytechnic. And so this is going from the top, from left to right. That's Edward George, Rhys Auguste, Trevor Matheson, David Lawson, Lena Gopal, who's Akomfrah's partner, and Everell Johnson. The group staged a rendition of Aimé Césaire's epic poem, Notebooks of a Return to My Native Land. And they combined a sequence of 35mm slides with spoken word performance poetry and ambient sound that was influenced by dub and also by musique concrète. After graduation, the group received funding from Channel 4 Television, which was established in 1982 with an official remit to widen access into broadcasting for filmmakers addressing Britain's ethnic minority populations. The collective were also supported by public funds from the Greater London Council, which followed a policy of municipal socialism before it was abolished by the Thatcher government in 1986. So it was in this context that all 7 members of the collective, who all shared responsibilities for script development, archival research, and the assembly of sound and image, produced their first film, Handsworth Songs, released in 1986. So before looking at a clip from the film, it's important for us to grasp the ambitions that were driving the group. In summer 1983, the collective published a statement on Black independent filmmaking that served as their manifesto. And it's noteworthy that the document has most recently been republished in a 2016 anthology, Why Are We Artists? 100 World Art Manifestos, that was edited by former Tate Modern curator Jessica Lack. Quote, "Our point of entry is around the issue of black representation," end quote. This is Akomfrah writing in 1983, saying, quote, "The collective was launched with 3 principal aims. Firstly, to attempt to look critically at how racist ideas and images of black people are structured and presented as self-evident truths in the cinema," end quote. So we should pause for a moment here. The target that Black Audio were taking aim at was realism, the prevailing cinematic language that presents the image as if it were an objective reflection of reality. The media studies' influence on the group's critique of racist stereotyping took aim at the content of prevailing representations of black people in British society. And this was a society in 1981 that was confronted by unprecedented civil disturbances in Brixton, in London, in Toxteth, in Liverpool, and these disturbances later resurfaced in Handsworth, in Birmingham, in 1985. But it's crucial for us to also notice the avant-garde influence that informed the collective's critical attitude towards realism. The illusion of realistic movement created when the film strip passes through the projector at 24 frames a second was the target of the historical avant-garde in European and American experimental filmmaking. Yet instead of the formalism that resulted when questions of content were bracketed and put to one side in the Euro-American avant-garde, Black Audio were the first to bring together the question of form with political content, addressing problems in cultural representations of black life. So the collective's second aim, quote, to develop a forum for disseminating available film techniques within the independent tradition and to assess their pertinence for black cinema, end quote, was as important as the third, which was, quote, to encourage means of extending the boundaries of black film culture by collapsing the distinction between audience and producer, end quote. So where the category of independent cinema refers to filmmaking that is not driven by commercial objectives, hence is not dependent on the financial systems of mainstream entertainment, nor by the individualism that characterizes the cinema of auteurism, in which the director, like the author of a novel, is seen as the exclusive agent of creativity. Unlike those objectives, Black Audio were committed to the belief that all forms of cultural production are political. Because if you're not questioning the established order of things, you are implicitly agreeing with the status quo. Unlike black filmmakers in Britain who used realism as their film language, such as Horace Ove, who made the first black British feature film, Pressure, it was released in 1975, and Menelik Shabazz, who wanted to put black content into a set of forms that were regarded as neutral and transparent. Unlike those practitioners, Black Audio set out to create a critical film culture that was inspired by the interventionist ethos of Latin American works, such as Memories of Underdevelopment, made in Cuba in 1968 by Tomas Guterres Alea, that in turn had served as the model for the third cinema concept that was proposed in 1969 by Argentinian filmmakers Fernando Solanas and Octavio Getino, who agreed with Glauber Rocha's notion of an aesthetics of hunger, in which cinema would act as a medium of transformational solidarity. So all this sounds fine in theory, but how did Hans Zimmer Songs put it into practice? Go for the next slide. Just now, I used the phrase civil disturbances, but 36 years ago, in 1981, language was never value neutral. Events that were reported as riots in the press and news media were referred to as uprisings by many black youth on the streets. So the struggle over meaning and the interpretation of events was precisely what was at stake in the war of naming the problem, as the voiceover says in the audio track of Hans Zimmer Songs. Rather than urge the viewer to take sides, the film addresses as its principal subject matter the contest over the social production of meaning that is present in every practice of representation. Whereas the dominant media represented the riots as random acts of lawlessness on a scale that took all by surprise, Akomfrah's aim was not to provide a corrective that would replace one regime of truth with another truth. Rather, his aim was to break open the closed codes and conventions by which the practice of representation strives to win popular consent by fixing the signifying chain of sound and image in narrative sequences of cause and effect. So, never once setting out to speak on behalf of Britain's black communities, unlike black filmmakers whose documentaries, such as Riots and Rumours of Riots by Imru Caesar in 1985, which sought to be representative of black communities as a whole, Hans Zimmer's songs instead laid out the polyvocal conditions on which the struggle over meanings of race and identity arise. Handsworth is an inner city area in the Midland city of Birmingham, whose manufacturing industries brought in many migrants from former colonies in the West Indies and the Indian subcontinent during the 1950s and early 1960s, when black immigrants filled labour shortages in the British economy devastated by the Second World War. But the film's very title indicates that it is not going to be a straightforward documentary. Songs mostly follow a cyclical pattern of time, whereas narrative is linear when beginning, middle and end structures our understanding of events in narrative sequences of cause and effect. Hans Zimmer Songs features the 5 elements that constitute a combinatory that's active in every black audio film collective production. That's original pro-filmic material. Mostly it's first-person testimony, bearing witness to events. Second is sync sound. Thirdly is archival footage from newsreel sources. This is often color-tinted, slowed down. Fourth is the poetic voiceover, on the soundtrack that alters the way in which we see the image. And finally is the ambient soundscape. These are all designed by Trevor Matheson, featuring sirens, drones, and other non-musical forms of auditory material. So the following clip we're about to see is bookended by two testimonial witnesses whose words define the meaning of events against the grain of media narratives. However, what I ask you to pay particular attention to is the voiceover and its expressive tone as it overlays a poetic story on top of archive footage of ships bringing black migrants into Britain. How does the voiceover affect what we feel and what we think when we see the images of the arrivants? The clip also features an interlude in which abstract sounds embed a slow tracking shot of black and white photographs suspended in a darkened space. In what ways do these still images comment on the way in which the montage combines archival material from the past with the pro-filmic material of the present day? So these are simply two questions to help us pinpoint the originality of Akomfrah's avant-garde aesthetic interventions. So we can have the first clip.
Background that just did it. Everybody feel that. The youths are angry. That police cannot. The youth, not only the unemployment, something that is just in the background that just did it. Everybody feel that, right? That's not a major part. It's the harassment that is going on with the black people in the area. So much brothers have been arrested. Almost 600 brothers or something like that. Crept off the street.
That was in July. That was in July.
In the July.
130
space for 2 weeks.
in July were arrested.
That's a bit much.
In unison on the deck, summoned by the water, and they stood there, brooding in collective silence. Suddenly a man in a black felt hat and a lively gabardine suit heaved hopelessly and uncontrollably, and his soul ran for the sea. But the winds rushed in and carried it back onto the deck. There it sat, abject and exposed. Without warning, the waters swept his soul from the deck. Zachariah looked at the water and felt the song swell inside him. It was said that each person recognized their fate in the song, and as he stood there, the Caribbean sank into the water. The land was there, but he will not go to it anymore.
I could see 4 policemen in the back of my house, and they pulled one lad, and they had him on the ground. They were smashing him, hitting him with their batting and so on, and he was bleeding all over his face, and till he's passed out. So I go to him and I says, "What you think you're doing? What you beating him for? You have him, you handcuffed him. Why don't you take him?" And he says, "Why don't I keep quiet?" I says, "This is your house. You break my gate down to come in here. Why should I keep quiet? Do you want to kill him? You talk about peace. That's how you're going to treat the lad. How are you going to expect peace when you do things like this?" Up to the night of the incident, the police was here. We gave them coffee. I and my wife, we made coffee for them out there. And about the 12 policemen were there, we all gave them coffee. But even since then, I changed my mind because I wasn't expecting officers, police officers to be doing that. I heard about it, of things like that happen, but I never seen things like that before.
So the man who gave the 12 policemen coffee when they said they were upholding law and order for the community was not just describing what happened when he saw the excess violence that they used to restrain a young man. His testimony conveyed the disillusionment, the disenchantment by which his own consciousness of his place in British society underwent a transformation as a result of what he witnessed. Similarly, when the Rasta woman said that the cause of the event was not merely unemployment, everyone would feel that, but the excessive force of police harassment targeted at young black males, she voiced a counter-definition of reality that spoke against the grain of media representations of the events. Okay. Indeed, where media representations of the 1981 and 1985 riots claimed shock and surprise, such narrative constructions of reality, in Stuart Hall's phrase, began from a place of amnesia, as if Britain's colonial relationship to the Caribbean and to India, Pakistan and Bangladesh had been completely forgotten. When Akomfrah wrote in Black Audio's 1983 manifesto that, quote, "The search is not for the authentic image, but for an understanding of the diverse codes and strategies of representation," end quote, we see that Handsworth Songs translated this filmically by creating a plural text of multiple voices. The result is to position the viewer not as a passive consumer of a message, but as an active participant involved in the polyvocality of meaning that is ordinarily repressed by realism. Akomfrah insists that Handsworth's black community is not a monolith speaking in one voice. When witnesses act as primary definers, they recode a bigger story about the relationship between post-war migration in the past and the present-day crisis of Britishness, brought into play in the struggles to make sense of the 1985 civil disturbances. So instead of the drive to bring narrative closure, instead of the narrative drive to bring explanatory closure, the clip showed how Akomfrah slows down the flow of sound and image, thereby opening a space for our broader reflection by dilating the temporal order in which the film unfolds. Unlike conflict-driven media narratives that put the categories of blackness and Britishness into a frontal opposition, the montage in Handsworth Songs creates instead a dialogic interaction, and it's this cinematic move that allows us to reflect on Britain's transformation as a once imperial nation that has had to come to terms with the loss of empire as the defining feature of its present-day standing in the world. So Handsworth Songs, in this sense, voices counter-memory, a term that Michel Foucault coined to describe subordinate traditions of knowledge that are often suppressed and pushed to the margins. Such counter-memory provides alternative ways of making events intelligible, that draw on long-term understandings of history that speak against the grain of the short-term news cycle on naming the problem, identifying the cause, and putting forward a solution. So now I'm back in sync, sorry. So documentary realism says that the camera never lies, and we might well agree that at one moment in the Customs Hall at Southampton Docks in 1956 really was full of newly arrived migrants. But when Roland Barthes distinguished denotation and connotation, he gave us tools for understanding how codes operate in the social life of representation. This distinction takes any lens-based image out of the purely neutral realm of factual reportage or denotation and into the ideological sphere in which some meanings gain dominance and win popular agreement by hiding and naturalizing the means by which their connotations come to carry politically loaded significance. We have the next slide. So once captioned 30,000 color problems, we see how the photograph is encoded by racialized meanings that equated the colonial migrant with the cause of social problems in post-war Britain. The anxiety and hostility of the white working class, which erupted in race riots in Notting Hill in 1958, was mostly left out of the equation. So captioning is one way that meaning comes to be fixed. The tightly cropped image showing one crowded moment gets loaded with further connotations by the layout of the magazine page. This is from Picture Post, 1956. The customs hall, in other words, becomes a metaphor for the British nation. It connotes the black migrants as a threat, since they are going to be overcrowding a small island. As we bear in mind these aspects of the encoding of race and representation, we begin to see the ingenuity of the montage strategies by which Akomfrah succeeded in unfixing such established patterns of meaning. So cutting and combining archival footage out of the narratives in which it was originally embedded, he lifts the black image out of its fixed meanings, such as those that equated the coloured immigrant with social problems. But to be clear, this is not the didactic substitution of one meaning with another equally fixed meaning, in which the black subject is to be portrayed as always the heroic bearer of a righteous struggle for social justice. Rather, the whole point of unfixing the codes is to create a third space, a space of critical reverie, in which it is our attentiveness as viewers that also gets unfixed, that gets loosened up from narrative expectations. In this way, Akomfrah's montage thus frees us up to unthink and then rethink our real-world relationship to the subject matter addressed on the screen. The effects created by Akomfrah's signature montage strategies can be startling and seductive at one and the same time. His montage touches us at an intimate level of affect. In the clip we just saw, the photo gallery of counter-memory is imbued with the tenderness of a family album. Simultaneously, the montage jolts us, it disturbs us, it demands that we as viewers must actively work to connect disparate fragments of sound and image. So as a consequence, we may find ourselves disenchanted and dissatisfied with established narratives. And in this way, we may become more receptive to new ways of perceiving present-day conditions. So before looking at a sixth element in Akomfrah's combinatorial repertoire, which is the enigmatic tableaux that are highly imagistic, I want to pull back for a moment to the bigger context of race in post-war Britain. In this way, we can clearly see how Akomfrah's artistic originality sheds fresh light on the post-colonial relationship between past and present. Foucault called this relationship archaeological, but Antonio Gramsci also commented upon it when he said that every moment in the present conjuncture is shot through with unresolved contradictions that have been sedimented in the social structure by past struggles. So the reason why Van Lee Burke's photograph of 1970 of a boy with his bike in a Birmingham park is so iconic, and we saw this photograph in the sequence, is because the juxtaposition of his blackness with the Union Jack flag asks whether the two categories of black and British really are as mutually exclusive as the dominant discourse said they were. Can the two elements be brought into a new articulation once they've been loosened and unfixed from the binary code in which their prevailing meaning has been established? When the Tory MP, Enoch Powell, that's him over there, encoded coloured immigrants as inherently incompatible with Britishness, as unchangeably other to every aspect of British cultural identity, he codified the discourse in which racism became institutionalized in 1970s Britain. And Margaret Thatcher picked up from this 10 years later in 1978, when she said it was natural for the British to feel anxious, even hostile, to incomers arriving into the nation's borders with a quote-unquote alien culture. So since we're all too well aware today of neo-nationalisms in Brexit Europe and the populist appeal of Trump's idea of building a wall to stop migrants entering the US from Mexico, I want to draw your attention to one specific moment in the cultural politics of anti-racism in 1970s Britain, because it involves an understanding of identity as a social phenomenon that is itself montage-like in character. So, with reference to these two images, Rock Against Racism got going in 1976, the same year as punk, to counteract the appeal of right-wing extremism in youth culture. But the music at Rock Against Racism gigs was never entertainment for people who were already committed to left-wing views. Rather, it was the medium in which people who were deeply dissatisfied with the order of things came together to see how they might prefigure alternative ways of living together. Culture always has a prefigurative role to play, or so Gramsci argued, for it's in the cultural realm of virtuality that multiple possibilities are up for grabs, even though not every single possibility will get to be actualized and brought into concrete reality. The white English kids who enjoyed Rock Against Racism were refusing the colonial equation that coded Britishness as an exclusively white identity, just as the black and Asian kids were rejecting the otherness imposed on them by the same equations in colonial discourse. So breaking the prevailing chain of equivalence, not by confronting the old order of things with a fully fledged alternative, but by re-articulating elements into alternative chains of equivalence, by first disarticulating them, breaking them out of their binary coding. Such logics of articulation, recombining existing elements into fresh configurations rather than creating them ex nihilo, are integral to the deep grammar of Akomfrah's cinematic practice. So we can have the next slide. So Testament of 1988 was Black Audio's follow-up. The protagonist in this feature-length narrative fiction, Abena, who is portrayed by the actor Tanya Rogers, is an activist from Ghana's post-independence era who returns to her country after 20 years of exile. What Abena must confront is not so much the failed dream of Pan-African socialism that Kwame Nkrumah envisioned when he came to power in 1957. What she must confront is the work of mourning that she must enact in order to accept the contingencies of history. Some might say that, like Nkrumah, Malcolm X presided over a political dream that also failed to become a reality. After his Hajj to Mecca in 1964, Malcolm X broke with the Nation of Islam. His encounter with Muslims from all over the world led him to form a new political platform, the Organization of Afro-American Unity. The OAAU envisioned a radical democratic future in which America's historical legacy of segregation would be transformed by racially inclusive activism. But as we know, Malcolm was assassinated on 21st February 1965 at the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem. However, Akomfrah asks us to question the somewhat cliched idea that the failure to realize a political dream is the only meaning signified by the death of an individual leader. If we accept such an equation, are we not buying into narrative simplification? Malcolm X actually visited Britain on his return journey to the United States after his Hajj. He spoke to students at Oxford University, and he visited the Midland towns of Smethwick near Birmingham. And that's the photograph that we see there from Handsworth Songs. But in 7 Songs for Malcolm X, the Black Audio Film Collective work of 1993, we see how Akomfrah's montage of archive footage, testimonial witness, ambient soundscapes, and other combinatorial elements work to complicate the Aristotelian logic that has given us the received narrative of Malcolm X that fixes his story as a political tragedy. So the clip we're about to see is from the start of the film. His widow, Betty Shabazz, tells us what happened on that day in 1965. And we also hear the first-person testimony from Yuri Kochiyama, the Japanese-American activist who lived in Harlem and who supported the cross-racial platform of the OAAU. But the element I'd like to highlight most is the enigmatic tableau that Akomfrah inserts to punctuate the flow of image and sound. As I ask you to think about the effects created by these tableaux, I need to set the scene by briefly describing the early 1990s context in which 7 Songs for Malcolm X was made. In the early 1990s, the new wave of African cinema, led by Spike Lee and others, tapped into the hunger for heroes on the part of black youth whose lives were being written out of the national script by the neoliberal agenda of Reagan and then Bush. Denzel Washington portrayed Malcolm in Lee's epic biopic of 1982. But Spike Lee stayed loyal to Aristotelian rules of narrative tragedy. His portrayal of Malcolm X was driven by protagonist conflict that resulted in the simplifications of a martyrdom narrative. The martyr who sacrifices his life for the greater good of his community is venerated as a hero. But there is a price we pay whenever our understanding of historical events is simplified by such storytelling. Because the martyrdom narrative fixates on the moment of death as the final act of closure that separates the past from the present, it positions the viewer as a merely passive consumer of an epic story. Instead of nourishing the desire for collective action to bring about change in the present, martyrdom narratives exploit the hunger for heroes by fixing all the action in the past. There is nothing to do in the present except lament the loss of a heroic individual. The problem is that such representations block our awareness of the unfinished and unresolved character of the present, prevent us from seeing that the potential for alternative future possibilities cannot be exhausted if the polyvocality of contingent events has not yet been fully explored. So this was the problem space into which Akomfrah intervened in 1993. The second clip.
How bad I make myself look by attacking an organization that I was once so inseparably a part of. But I'm not particularly concerned with how bad it makes me look. My prime concern is to expose it to the fullest of my ability. Let the chips fall where they may.
Well, we all went to the meeting, and I had my children with me, and we were sitting in the front, facing the sides of the Audubon, not facing the back looking front.
Benjamin got up on the stage and he started to speak. And usually I take notes, and I still have the notes I took then, and I'll read some excerpts. Anyone opening the door will face life or death. We must not care for personal consequences. Such a person is a good man who would put concern.
When the last thing I said was, I never bring before you a man who would give his life for his people.
Just after he said that, there was a commotion in the middle of the room, and there was a distraction when 2 men seemed to jumped up, and one said, "Get your hands out of my pocket." And everybody, of course, had turned to look at these 2 men, and just then it seemed like shots were fired from the front.
I had 4 children, and I threw their bodies underneath the bench and covered them with my body. And it was my oldest daughter who said she could not breathe, and so that I kind of moved slightly so that she could get some air and breathe. And as I moved, kind of raised my head, and I saw someone gasping like something horrible was happening. And I looked to the front to see my husband falling back.
Then it was like all hell broke loose. A young brother passed me on the aisle, and so I told my son, stay here, and I followed him because I knew he must be going up to the stage, and I wanted to know how Malcolm was doing. And I got up there, and I went to Malcolm. He was breathing heavily, and I put his head on my lap, and other people came and they opened his shirt, and you could see that he was shot all over.
Okay, so the whale cries in the ambient soundscape set a tone that's both foreboding, alerting us to the likelihood of a violent event, but it's also mournfully elegiac, acknowledging the loss of a truly revolutionary figure in the era of late modernity. So ordinarily, the laws of narrative would seek to address the event of an assassination by asking who did it and why? Who was responsible? Have they been brought to justice? What was their motivation? And we're accustomed, by virtue of the predominance of realism and cinema's contract with the real, to think it is natural and obvious that every film should be driven by the urge to answer these questions. For his part, however, Akomfrah put the entire code in suspension. The tableau that we saw punctuating that sequence operate to slow down, to de-accelerate our relationship to the image. By slowing down the rate at which we encounter the archival image, the montage leads us out of the teleological drive towards narrative closure. What Akomfrah achieves by such means is a reopening of everything that was at stake in the political dreams that narrative realism conditions us to think came to a complete and final ending with the tragic death of the martyred hero. Akomfrah begins from the Gramscian premise that if such political dreams are unfulfilled and unfinished, then there is still a portion of them that is not yet dead. There is still a portion of these dreams that have not finally extinguished, despite ideological efforts to convince us that the struggle for a different future is now buried in the grave of history. So the tableaux in that sequence have a haunting quality. They implant enigmas in our mind instead of the urgent quest for answers. In saturated colours, the stillness of the funeral tableau in which mourners gather around a corpse is itself a poetic condensation of the piercing effect, the punctum, whereby such indecipherable scenes give us, as viewers, pause. Akomfrah tableau invite our thoughts and feelings to wander and roam over the testimonial materials, allowing us to pick up on resonances from the past that illuminate the present. With their imagistic potency, Akomfrah's tableaux are aphoristic. They compact multiple strata of meaning into one iconic frame, and such tableaux linger in the mind by virtue of arresting, de-accelerating, and slowing down the forward-moving momentum we've come to expect from the moving image. And it's crucial to bear in mind the distinction between symbol and allegory in this regard. A symbol's meaning is always fixed. It gains its power from the unambiguous correlation of signifier and signified. For example, Christians instantly recognize what is symbolized by the cross, just as Muslims do not hesitate over the meaning of the crescent and the star. But allegory, on the other hand, is protean and shape-shifting. One image may give rise to divergent meanings in different times and places. one allegorical image may take on contradictory meanings for different viewers, depending on their identificatory positioning. Today, it's become too easy to say that artists are involved in the unfixing of meaning, as if it were a matter of pressing a button in a semiotic program. Unlike the formalist avant-garde from Hollis Frampton and Michael Snow in the 1960s to Doug Aitken today, John Akomfrah understands that meaning is not a purely plastic property that exists inside the image as an autonomous entity. He understands that meanings circulate in our context-dependent relationship to the image. And you can always tell that this is a social rather than purely plastic or formal relationship by virtue of the fact that people tend to disagree and argue over the meaning of images. After all, if meaning were inside the image, no one would ever disagree. But unlike the interventionist avant-garde of third cinema, for example, Akomfrah steps aside from the content-driven didacticism that wants an equally fixed set of counter-meanings to prevail over currently dominant meanings. Drawing from both traditions, he's created a third space of hyphenation. A third space of hyphenation and dialogic translation. In this third arena, the politics of representation has everything to do with reopening codes and signifying conventions that are ordinarily closed, and then working to keep this space open. In this way, our attachments to the image, our cognitive and affective relationship to the image flow, can be loosened up and made available for both our own individual reflection and for public debate that questions the apparent naturalness of representational systems predicated on realism. So reopening the representational space surrounding the traumatic moment of death is no easy feat. You certainly can't do it by pressing a button. So why is the iconography of the corpse so prevalent amongst post-colonial artists? This was a question I asked at the conference of the second Johannesburg Biennale in 1997. I was, however, simply following the lead that Akomfrah laid down in a 1993 interview in the Toronto magazine Borderlines. There, he came up with the following statement, which I think you'll agree is just as startling to hear today as it was over 25 years ago. Quote, "I think necrophilia lies at the heart of black filmmaking," end quote. Necrophilia, the love of the dead, sounds morbid. Yet Akomfrah clarifies his allegorical use of the term. Quote, "I mean necrophilia not in a literal sense, but in a postmodern sense in which people are invoking figures. There is an act of feeding off the dead," end quote. It soon becomes clear that his coinage complicates the two-term Freudian distinction between mourning and melancholia. Akomfrah, in other words, was offering us a third term that, quote, has to do with getting to the heart of something that is intangible, a memory of ourselves. Have the next slide. So the mortuary portraits that James Van der Zee took in Harlem from the 1910s to the 1940s were the iconographic source that Akomfrah drew from when he said, quote, "When you seize hold of these figures, they literally turn to masks and statues in your hand. But when you get over it, when you're comfortable with that mask, then the desire shifts from melancholia to necrophilia. You almost begin to desire these figures precisely because they are irretrievable, impossible to capture, therefore dead," end quote. What he is addressing here is the emotional reality of loss, the absence whereby survivors feel that part of themselves is absent, has gone missing, when their loved ones are deceased. The absence caused by death cannot be made whole by representation. One could say the irretrievable absence, the enduring sense of loss, is unrepresentable as such. And if you observe African American funeral rituals, such as the open casket, which we see in the mortuary portrait, you notice a significant cultural difference. Death is shunned and rendered invisible on the part of America's Anglo-Protestant majority. But black diaspora cultures may at times embrace death as freedom from the social death of slavery. This was what Toni Morrison spoke to in the infanticide at the heart of her novel, Beloved. And you can see an aspect of necrophilia in the sheer number of flowers surrounding the open casket in the 1944 mortuary portrait by James Van der Zee. Too much will never be enough to make present what is now absent. That is what the funeral wreaths are signifying. The sheer excess of flowers indicates an awareness of the limits of representation. It is acknowledging something that is unrepresentable as such. It's understood that behind the signifier stands the nothingness, the lack around which human desire is set into motion. And I've paired it with a still from Looking for Langston, 1989 film by Isaac Julian, because Julian shared the same iconographic source, these portraits by James Van der Zee, as Akomfrah. Julian's film acknowledges the ancestor figures that are venerated in diaspora culture, not as heroic or substantial presences, but as ghostly, evanescent allegories. Like Akomfrah, he sees hauntingness not as something to be feared, but as something to be desired, to be welcomed, as a source of future-facing inspiration, predicated on the understanding that the ancestral dead are not locked into a separate narrative compartment of the past, but like the unrequited hopes and unfulfilled dreams, they permeate the present, sometimes pointing to clues for future possibilities of which we may not yet be aware. Have the next slide. On the steps of Elmina Castle, this was the Portuguese fort that was a hub in the Atlantic slave trade from the 1490s onwards, Abena wanders like a ghost. Yet in many respects, she's a time traveller, just like the data thief in Akomfrah's 1996 meditation on Afrofuturism that was commissioned by ZDF Television in Germany. This is the last angel of history. Angels and ghosts are allegorical time travellers. They are allegorical siblings that go together. That's because ghosts and angels alike travel across the temporal boundaries of past, present, and future that are codified by narrative. In other words, Akomfrah's ability to scramble the narrative segmentation of time to which we are habituated is political in its own right, because it frees us up, however temporarily, from subjection to discursive fixation points that prevent us from seizing the power to shape our own futures. When we passively consume heroic images of black freedom fighters, we may think we're celebrating traditions of resistance, but we are in fact colluding with a conservative repression that is deeply afraid of the past. Such repression lives in fear of reopening the grave, on the grounds that the violent history of slavery and colonialism is so painful as to be overwhelming. So epic was the crime of slavery, runs this line of thought, as Fanon scholar François Verges sums up, that, quote, the participants in the crime would remain incapable of recognizing their participation, end quote. Hence, again this is Verges, the world is then like a grave, inhabited by ghosts whose presence haunts the living, end quote. The alternative, argues Verges, is, quote, opening the grave, freeing the ghosts, mourning the dead. For this would be a start in the process of anamnesis, end quote. Anamnesis is the recollection of a past life to which access was previously blocked by amnesia. So Akomfrah's Angels and Ghosts, remember that the tagline for Handsworth's songs was, there are no stories in the riots, only the ghosts of other stories. These angels and ghosts are the iconographic agents of such anamnesis, by virtue of their allegorical time travel. Next slide. So as we come up to date with Nine Muses of 2010, which is a single screen work arising from a gallery installation called Nemesis, we begin to glimpse the scale on which Akomfrah's montage practice has contributed to the post-colonial consciousness that is now one of the defining conditions of global contemporary art. In turning away from documentary realism, which always trusted the image to make present that which was absent, to bring back that which is missing, Akomfrah entered the archive not in search of evidence that would give his story the final word, but, quote, to seize hold of a memory as it flashes up at a moment of danger, end quote. And it's worth quoting Walter Benjamin's line in full if we are to grasp how powerfully we are touched and moved by celluloid fragments and snatches of sound on magnetic tape that Akomfrah montages together so carefully in Nine Muses. Quote, to articulate the past historically does not mean to recognize it the way it really was, says Benjamin, who is critical of the positivist model of historiography that places its trust in representation as something that can deliver the truth of events. Quote, it means to seize hold of a memory as it flashes up in a moment of danger. So the memory at stake concerns past traditions of insurgent knowledge, the counter-memories by which subaltern subjects understood the power structures that shaped their lives. And the danger that Benjamin speaks of is the constant effort on the part of those who dominate social life to win consent and secure their hegemony by domesticating and incorporating traditions of dissent through their control of the symbolic order of representation, the apparatus that governs our contract with the real, our perception of the real, and our ability to act on it. Earlier, in his 1940 text, The Theses on the Philosophy of History, Benjamin said, quote, the tradition of the oppressed teaches us that the emergency situation in which we live is the rule, end quote. Once we isolate this one word, emergency, we see how Akomfrah addresses that portion of the image that concerns emergent possibility, the virtual dimension or aura that endows the image with pluripotentiality, that marks the image not just as a document of what has been, but also a site of what is yet to come. So in Nine Muses, newsreel footage showing migrants making the journey of a lifetime is reworked by Akomfrah's tender handling of archival fragments. His signature montage devices such as color tinting, frame rate, film speed, and voiceover bring out something in the image that liberates it to say more than what it offers as documentary evidence. The hopes and dreams of those who crossed oceans in search of a new future were certainly dashed and disappointed by the bitter realities they encountered in the ruins of a former empire. But even if their visions of a better future were put to the test by disenchantment, Akomfrah nonetheless calls up from these orphaned images that he finds in the archive an effective power that is in excess of their indexical value as documentary evidence. It is this extra, this surplus that touches us when we watch his films. And it's by these aesthetic means that Akomfrah reveals that the dreams and desires that gave the migrants their drive may have been disappointed, but they were never completely extinguished. These dreams are not dead. His montage reveals that something has been lost, but it's not completely gone. In the Arctic setting of the Nine Muses, one might say that if all images freeze time, then there is something beneath the ice that is not yet dead, that is still alive with potentiality. Akomfrah encourages us to see that every lens-based image is haunted by its relation to a past that is not yet over, which is also to say at one and the same time that every image thus anticipates a future that is yet to come. The image, as Akomfrah handles it, is therefore always a site of becoming. So as we watch the following clip, we do well to bear in mind that the ability to awaken this latent futurity within the multi-temporal space of the image is rare, and it's certainly not within the grasp of every filmmaker who enters the archive. Let's have this clip.
A black man upset you with all his heart more than how you upset me. When I come pure heart, with my heart pure for you, love you, would never harm you, never do nothing that's wrong, feel that you're just a man like me.
Athens and Delphi lies the great seven-gated city of Thebes, founded by Cadmus, brother of Europa. He it was that killed the dragon and sowed the dragon's teeth, from which sprang the giants, fully armed, who were the founding fathers of Thebes. Oedipus, the young heir to the throne of Corinth, was given a prophecy by the oracle at Delphi that he was to kill his father and marry his mother. Determined to avoid his monstrous destiny, he never returned to his home, but travelled on foot in the direction of Thebes. As Oedipus approached Thebes, he discovered that the city was being persecuted by the Sphinx, a winged lion with the head of a woman who devoured any young man who passed her way and failed to answer her riddle: what goes on 2 legs, on 4 legs, and on 3 legs, and is weakest on 4? Oedipus at once challenged her with his solution. The answer, he said, is man. As a child, he goes on all 4s. Fully grown, he goes on 2 legs. And in old age, the stick he walks with makes a 3rd.
So the Rukn figure, or the figure seen from behind, is an iconographic trope that dates to antiquity. And in Akomfrah's frequent use of it, we can see the plural meanings that he sets into play. At once the lone individual confronting the sublime vastness of non-human nature. The Rukn figure in the Nine Muses is also a witness who stands on the threshold of a scene, neither inside nor outside, but in between. while at the same time such a trope is a surrogate for what we ourselves are doing as viewers, since looking is the act by which the Rücken figure engages with the world. When asked in a 2016 why it was such a central motif in his work, or even whether it was a stand-in for the filmmaker himself, Akomfrah gave the following reply, quote, "That figure is the quintessential romantic subject, made famous by Caspar David Friedrich. What is important about that figure, for me, as a figure of colour, is this. It shows the extent to which Romanticism defined itself as a new project that said that man, with a capital M, had the ability to access the world in the absence of the Almighty. That opened a conceptual door, because it was only really then that people could seriously accept the sensory properties that are unique to man, with a capital M." End quote. So let's think about the implications of that, for they're extremely far-reaching. Vision was all-important for Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man in 1492. 17th century empiricists and mechanical materialists extended the world-making project in which sight, and by extension all systems of visual representation, enabled man, with a capital M, to take symbolic possession of the world, to colonize the world through vision. But when Immanuel Kant cast doubt on the reliability of the knowledge that comes through our 5 bodily senses, his 18th century Enlightenment outlook set the stage for the rationalist denigration of the body that was carried out in the name of the transcendental categories of pure thought. So as Romanticism entered into battle with rationalism, it set in motion the decentering of man in both modern philosophy and in modernist art. In exploring the limits and conditions of our human sensory capacities, the investigative thrust of inquiry led to the dissolution of man, as Foucault pointed out in 1966, when he published his Archaeology of the Human Sciences, The Order of Things. So with man understood now not as the agent in control of things, but as a subject put into place by systems of representation, post-colonial discourse followed up to show that the binary code through which man sought to gain control over nature was dependent in its functioning on the same representational conventions through which mind sought mastery over the body, through which the masculine wanted to control the feminine, through which Europe placed itself at the center of modernity by subjugating Africa into a place of otherness. Except at no point was Akomfrah illustrating a set of insights that post-colonial theorists had already arrived at. By means of celluloid and digital images, magnetic tape and high-definition pixels, his montage practice had opened up in its own right an entirely unique space for thought in contemporary art. I have the next slide. So we heard the anonymous Caribbean migrant in that clip say, "We love you, but you don't love we." Okay? That the black man would accept the European in his heart, but the European did not accept the black man. What he was summing up was the counter-memory, the knowledge that colonial subjects acquired on account of being on the underside of the master-slave dialectic. The man is telling us quite eloquently that there is no reciprocity in the master-slave relationship. He is saying that in the representational space that placed Western man at the symbolic center of things, man could never see his dependency on the other, whether that other was the racialized body, the female body, or the body of nature. Hence, man could never see or accept the vulnerability that defines the human condition. It is because the human self is weak in its interdependence on others that all humans have fantasies about being strong and powerful. Fantasies that provide the mythic bedrock of the representational systems that constitute every culture. In a similar vein, we saw Leary Constantine take a train journey. Born in Trinidad, Constantine was a cricketer who settled in London in the 1920s, becoming a barrister after the war when he entered politics. challenging discrimination at all levels of British society. So as he joined the South African playwright Louis Nkosi, the two form a double Rooken figure, bearing witness to the writing on the wall. The writing told black settlers what the white British were really thinking and feeling. But the witness who sees it has a knowledge of social reality that is lacking on the part of the majority, who are more than likely to overlook such graffiti. So Nine Muses reframes the migrant experience of journeying through sources that Akomfrah appropriated from the Western literary canon, most notably from Homer's Odysseus. And in the clip we heard Oedipus Rex, a fragment thereof, by Sophocles that was voiced by Richard Burton, one amongst a multitude of spoken word recitations that Akomfrah took from the Naxos Recordings archive. We should not underestimate the philosophical gravitas of such a post-colonial gesture. Akomfrah put the entire Western canon at the service of the migrant story. But let's be clear, this is not an inversion of the master-slave relation that switches the content to be found in each place while preserving the binary code. On the contrary, as we've seen in each example we've examined in this masterclass, the whole point for Akomfrah of disarticulating, of deconstructing the dominant code, is to re-articulate, reconstruct, reconfigure the building blocks of signification so as to restructure the identificatory positioning by which we define our attachments to and investments in the world through representational systems of meaning. So the last slide. So by way of conclusion, I want to close with a clip from the 3-screen installation Vertigo C. It was widely acclaimed as one of the standout works in the 56th edition of the Venice Biennale that was organized by Okwe and Weezer under the heading All the World's Futures. It's now some 25 years since the Black Atlantic concept was introduced by the Black British social theorist Paul Gilroy, who actually borrowed the term from the art historian Robert Farris Thompson. And there are many today who feel that concepts of diaspora migration, like globalization, have been exhausted in cultural criticism. Far from it was Akomfrah's quiet reply. With events in Syria that have led to unplanned migrations on a massive scale, we are seeing a new diaspora in the making, right before our eyes. In the treacherous oceanic crossings by which clandestine migrants from Mali or Chad or from Congo and Sudan risk their lives in precarious boats on the Mediterranean, with many not making the crossing at all, we see that the oceanic sublime that was so important to 19th century romantics, such as the British painter J.M.W. Turner or Herman Melville, the American author of Moby Dick in 1851, that this notion of the Atlantic sublime is alive and well in today's world. If we think of the artist as a heroic individual who is giving us all the answers that we can passively consume, then we have completely missed the point. Avant-garde art making was always experimental and interventionist at the same time, from the Soviet constructivists in the 1920s to Jean-Luc Godard in the 1960s. Discussing his influences, Akomfrah singled out Ritwik Ghatak, Robert Bresson, Andrei Tchaikovsky, and what he called English Brechtian cinema of the 1970s, adding, quote, "It was very much a conception of cinema as a machinery of movement through which you could explore questions of rhythm, tempo, colour, and so on. Very formal questions," end quote. Combining formal questions with ethical, political, and philosophical ones, Vertigo C invites us to reflect on our planet's ecological crisis. Akomfrah shows us not a single-issue problem in need of a narrative solution, but a worldly reality brought about as a consequence of man, with a capital M, who since 1492 went out into the planet as if he were the Almighty. Some 4 centuries later, man discovers not just the species extinction, or rather the possible species extinction of the polar bear or the blue whale, but the tangible possibility that industrial modernity, if it continues unsustainably, has the potential to obliterate planet Earth altogether. Instead of offering answers, Vertigo C is all the more immersive as it engages us to unthink cultural fantasies of symbolic control and to re-feel the vulnerabilities that define our human interdependence on others who are representationally dehumanized in the media as swarms and hordes. And more than this, the montage in Vertigo C asks us to reflect on our human dependence on water, on oxygen, on the entire realm of non-human matter that is other to us, even as it is also the precondition without which there would be no human species to begin with. So if we could have the final clip.
Of a ship who purchased a young woman with a fine child about a year old. In the night, the child cried much and disturbed his sleep. He rose up in great anger, tore the child from the mother, and threw it into the sea. Do I speak of one child when we have heard of over 100 men cast into the sea?
One last point I'd like to make is this. Vertigo C was enthusiastically embraced by many critics who instantly recognized that in an era of contemporary art that is overpopulated with disposable items made for market, here was an artist able to command philosophical gravitas with a light touch. Go to any Akomfrah installation, and apart from the screens, the most interesting thing you can observe is the attentiveness of the audience. In an age of data overload, there is a real hunger for the aesthetic intelligence of art. But when Vertigo C was praised by one critic in the following terms, and here I paraphrase, that Akomfrah has left behind the particularism of inner city riots and now has embraced the universalism of planetary ecology. We realize how far our language as critics and scholars lags behind the aesthetic intelligence embodied in Akomfrah's montage. To cling to the binary code of the universal and the particular is to bypass the entire logic of hybridization that has fueled Akomfrah's practice from the start. To fall back on a racialized dichotomy between inner city strife and a planet engulfed by the crisis of the Anthropocene is to overlook Akomfrah's lifelong commitment to translating signifying elements dialogically from one semantic field into another, the cross-cultural logic of intermediate migration that refuses to make choices within an either-or worldview, and that cuts open instead into a third space. So alongside the irresistible visual seduction of the high-definition material that Akomfrah took from the BBC Natural History Unit, who had a hand in commissioning Vertigo C, we saw fragments of a television drama rendition of enslaved Africans being thrown overboard. This referred to the massacre of over 100 captives aboard the Zong slave ship, who in 1781, when the ship lost course in crossing the Atlantic, were sent to their deaths when the captain decided the insurance claim to be made for damage to his cargo was worth more than the life of the human cargo itself. But far from making a cause and effect narrative to connect the Atlantic slave trade in the past with today's crisis of refugees and migration, the intercutting of shots from underneath the waves encourages us to think about an aquatic archive. Layers of deep time exist behind the shallow surfaces on which today's crisis of migration is represented. Vertigo C also intercuts grainy black and white footage of early 20th century Arctic exploration with enigmatic tableaus such as the lone 18th century soldier wearing a tricorn hat that we saw in the clip. As such intercutting unfolds over its 40-minute duration, what comes across with great clarity without having to be spelled out is that the slave trade was historically connected to the whaling industry that drove the Industrial Revolution. Why? Because prior to fossil fuels and then electricity, the slave's body, like the blubber of a whale, was the basic unit of energy on which industrial civilization was built. Now, ordinarily, we would never see such a chain of equivalence. Yet with a subtle touch and on a scale bordering on the sublime, Akomfrah reminds us that nature is never a static entity. Is never the static entity we often romanticize it as being. While some species face extinction as a result of life-threatening conditions, new species are coming into being. One example is the Osedax, or bone-eating worm. It emerged, and you remember our previous emphasis on emergency, as a new life form that came into being by feeding off whale fall, the bones of dead whales that fall to the deepest part of the ocean floor. And all of this was discovered only in 2002. So Akomfrah encapsulates an understanding of such processes of becoming, not in any one image and not in any one narrative sequence, but in the in-between spaces he opens up in montaging sound and image. So there's great optimism in the journey of becoming that Akomfrah invites us to join. That sense of hopefulness has everything to do with the way that his cinematic eye fearlessly confronts the reality of death in the human condition. The third space he opens up through his montage anticipates a dialogical public, willing to explore difference and ready to disagree while knowing that dissent is what keeps the conversation open-ended and alive. So I'd like to commend the many people whose efforts have made it possible for this retrospective of John Akomfrah to be externalized in Brazil, and I hope that the dialogues that his work will provoke in this context will continue for many years to come.
Muito obrigado, professor Kobena Mercer. Foi uma introdução muito abrangente e profunda sobre a obra do Akomfrah. Eu acho que ilumina um pouco esses aspectos da necrofilia, e quando ele fala sobre os espectros, os fantasmas, acho que ilumina um pouco também a nossa intenção quando a gente nomeou essa mostra de espectros da diáspora, né? E esse tema da necrofilia é retrabalhado em um artigo do Kobena Mercer, que foi incluído no nosso catálogo, um artigo dedicado ao Akomfrah, que analisa o filme Testament. E, como eu falei aqui para quem estava na sessão anterior, o catálogo vai estar disponível a partir da sexta, mas ele já está disponível, a versão online já está no ar. Eu teria várias perguntas para fazer, mas eu queria abrir para vocês. Alguém tem alguma questão? Gostaria de colocar alguma pergunta? Kobena Mercer? Ninguém? Eu queria então... eu vou então começar, vou colocar algum... você tem uma pergunta?
Não é técnica, não é sobre o Ok, não é uma pergunta técnica e eu peço desculpas por isso. Eu não sou da área de arte nem de cinema, eu sou da área de história.
Não está funcionando.
Okay.
Você pode falar um pouquinho mais
It's coming. Yeah.
Ok.
Sorry.
Não é uma pergunta técnica, não é uma pergunta específica sobre o Akomfrah. Eu não sou da área de arte, eu sou da área de história, trabalho com a questão da diáspora negra. E eu queria um pouco saber o legado hoje na Inglaterra desse cinema coletivo e, ao mesmo tempo, eu gostaria... Recentemente eu li na BBC uma ampla reportagem da Inglaterra celebrando, em função de toda essa crise que vem desde os anos, de todos os conflitos dos anos 50, 60, e hoje celebrando a pluralidade racial da sociedade inglesa. Tá? Mas, ao mesmo tempo, a gente vê um ator como o Idris Elba, eu pronuncio Idris Elba, não sei se seria Idris Elba, não sei, mas a gente vê um ator como ele ainda sendo rejeitado para um papel, por exemplo, de James Bond, e tendo que se mudar para os Estados Unidos em função da falta de espaço nas artes ou no cinema britânico, né, para um personagem negro, digamos assim. Então, eu só queria ouvi-lo a esse respeito. Obrigada.
Okay. When we expect narrative... Sorry, I can't hear myself think. When we expect narrative happy endings, that shows the extent to which our perception is conditioned by narrative. History doesn't come to a full stop. It's in a constant process of becoming. So you have media representations of happy pluralism in Britain, which of course is a construction. It's an ideological fabrication. Nonetheless, if you look at that history of the half century since the middle of the 20th century, the British had to confront the reality that they had lost their empire. That meant they had to confront what whiteness was. Whiteness is not equivalent to the human. It's not a universal identity. They were challenged in that by the Scottish, by the Welsh, by the Irish, who are all asking, what is this united in United Kingdom? So when you think relationally, in terms of how different elements are brought together in a composite formation, the good news is that they can be taken out of an existing pattern and hopefully put into an alternative pattern. And they were. That was the success of anti-racism. Doesn't mean that racism is abolished. If you think that racism can be abolished completely, that's like a fairy tale understanding of history that, of course, you as a historian would reject, you would question. So you have a situation in which there are losses and gains. and they have to be put into context. You might want to look at the way in which Britain tried to come to terms with its post-colonial history. Has the same thing taken place in Belgium, in France, in Sweden, in Germany? That's one way of framing it and breaking us out of the beginning, middle and ending conditioning that narrative conditions us to expect. So I think Idris Elba is a case in point of stereotyping is still alive and well. There's still a very narrow range of roles that are available. He is only one of many actors who might migrate to the popular cinema of America. So all of this is to say that it's an unfinished conversation, that these questions have to be kept alive. And part of doing that, whether it's in the gallery, whether it's in the Cinematheque, whatever the media platform, is really to question and undermine this happy ending that the media relies on, but which it actually affects us and conditions us as well.
Alguém teria alguma outra pergunta? Professor, como o senhor pode nos informar sobre a sua concepção do cinema brasileiro e das produções afro-brasileiras? Como o senhor o enxerga e de que maneira poderia nos dizer no que melhorar?
I can't, because I don't know enough about Afro-Brazilian cinema. It would be interesting, however, to learn what the terms of debate are, what the criticisms are of the existing films. I don't think it's the role of any critic to say how anybody can improve, but I don't study Afro-Brazilian cinema, so I'm not in a position to comment constructively, unfortunately.
Para mim foi muito surpreendente a questão de uma crítica ao realismo que é feita recuperando uma tradição dos artistas de vanguarda que já vinham colocando esse tipo de questões. Bom, daí fiquei pensando um pouco também como o lugar da imagem como evidência, né? Quando o senhor disse num determinado momento que esse lugar da imagem como essa crença realista do realismo de que o lugar da imagem como uma evidência, a última palavra pode nos entregar uma verdade sobre a realidade, que isso é uma coisa que ele vem criticar. E é quase como se fosse um positivismo estético, levando em conta a forma como um historiador muitas vezes pode tratar as evidências, e é muito desafiador para um historiador colocar esse tipo de questão para a imagem, porque muitas vezes o historiador faz pouco tempo usando a imagem como uma fonte documental, então como esse cinema já coloca esse tipo de questão para a imagem. Então, estou tentando aqui entender a minha pergunta, eu mesma, né? E, e acho que, ao mesmo tempo, porque eu sou historiadora, mas ao mesmo tempo como nos desloca enquanto espectadores, que somos constantemente soterrados por imagens, né? Então, me provoca tanto como historiadora como espectadora, né? Então, uma coisa muito... Enfim, não sei se tem uma pergunta.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think context is really important. And I think that struggles over the meaning of an image are always context dependent. It doesn't mean that they can't translate, that we can't learn from one context to another, but a legal or a juridical context in which images are being put forward like security camera footage is one example in which there are very real-world consequences of how meaning is constructed from a lens-based image. And that's very different from CGI. Okay, even though you know it's computer-generated imagery, it's more like a painting because there was no camera, there's no lens involved. But people, we still interpret these fantasy movies in terms of cause and effect, protagonist conflict, the whole Aristotelian code. So I think your question can be perhaps approached in terms of thinking about whether art has a role to play in stimulating awareness of these different contexts. That even though in terms of the medium, we seem to be dealing with the same thing, whether it's an image in a court or something that you watch on your digital screen, they're very different cultural systems, they're very different forms of representation, practices of representation. And it's a good question as to whether art gives us enough critical space to raise these questions, or whether the art world has been indested into the entertainment industry, so that people go to galleries to take selfies and to say that I went to the gallery. They're not engaging with the art, right? The art is a pretext, in which case our days are numbered. There's probably very little we can do. But I suppose for those who haven't given up on the avant-garde tradition, it's not so much that Akomfrah was trying to recover the avant-garde. I mean, a lot of people say the historical avant-garde is just a history of failure. It got buried in the museum. But it's an attempt to ask whether the impetus, the impulse to ask questions instead of giving answers, whether that has been completely exhausted. And I think in relation to the first question, we see that people are still, people still have strong opinions about an image, whether it's Idris Elba or any other example from contemporary popular culture. But it's finding a constructive arena in which to have a genuine dialogue about what's at stake in these different interpretations. That seems to be narrowed down. One aspect, there's a kind of reductionism in social media, which is anti-dialogic. People don't debate, they just have opinions. And if you don't agree with me, you're my enemy. If you're not my friend, I will unfriend you. So that space for disagreement, which was the dream of the Enlightenment, is shrinking. And the question that Akomfrah is asking is, can the gallery be a space to keep it open? Or is it just going to collapse anyway, and should we give up?
Boa noite, obrigado pela palestra, obrigado pelas palavras. Eu tenho uma pergunta, duas perguntas. O que nós podemos considerar como assinatura Akomfrah? Tipo de elementos que a gente vê numa obra e fala assim, esse com certeza é um filme do Akomfrah. E eu admito que eu estou conhecendo o trabalho dele agora nessa mostra, eu estou me surpreendendo com a qualidade dos trabalhos. Que outros cineastas que a gente pode esperar que trabalham na mesma linha que ele, que o senhor recomendaria, que fala, olha, presta atenção nesse personagem, ou nesse artista?
So in the 90s, there was a whole range of essay films that really had, I think, an influence from Black Audio Film Collective, because instead of using the archive image as historical evidence or the pro-filmic image as documentary evidence, they were putting the two together in a questioning way. So Raoul Peck made a film about Patrice Lumumba. And of course, this is another assassination story. He became a martyr. But instead of trying to find out who did it, who is responsible, we all know it was I won't go into that. He was showing how there's a multi-perspectival contest between those in Africa, those in Belgium, those in the diaspora, those elsewhere in Europe, over what Patrice Lumumba stood for. What did he represent? And what did his death mean as well? So Lumumba, Death of a Prophet by Raoul Peck, I think it was 92. There's also an interesting film, and it's interesting, it's apart from African and Caribbean filmmakers are featured prominently in taking an influence from Akomfrah. So Alatontu by David Ashkar came out in the mid-1990s, and his father was imprisoned by Sekou Touré. His father had been a cultural ambassador. He led a ballet troupe in Paris in the 1950s, and after independence played a very important role in building up the cultural life of Guinea. But he was imprisoned because of his dissent by Sekou Touré, and he disappeared. So this is a son making a film about his father's death, and it's not so much, it's the fact of not knowing what actually happened. And I think this is why an anti-realist or even anti-narrative stance is so important. When death is over-personalized and it can only be interpreted as a tragedy, we tend to have an override of emotion. We tend to have films that manipulate the sorrow we feel with the death of Malcolm X, with the death of someone like David Ashkar's father. But that makes us passive, and it prevents any curiosity about how did this happen, or why do these events happen again and again. So I think this is, it's not a cause and effect, did this film bring about social change? No, that's the wrong model to use. That is not, in a mass-mediated world, that is not going to work. But I think that interrogative stance of asking questions shows the influence of Akomfrah on David Ashkar and Raoul Peck, for example. Alatonto.
Boa noite. A obra de Godard tem uma importância grande para o Akomfrah. Eu queria entender quais são os pontos de aproximação e os pontos de distanciamento.
Okay, can you start again? Yeah.
Ele perdeu o começo, pode. Ah, tá. A obra de Godard tem importância grande para o Akomfrah. E uma segunda pergunta, mais de cunho biográfico, eu queria entender... fazer a pergunta toda, tá. Tá. A obra de Godard tem importância grande para o Akomfrah. Eu queria entender os pontos de aproximação e os pontos de distanciamento. E uma segunda pergunta biográfica, eu queria entender como foi a sua aproximação como espectador com a obra de Akomfrah. Você fala que tem um diálogo de 30 anos já com ele. Eu queria entender como é que foi essa aproximação sua.
Well, I'll start with the second one. That's a bit easier. So I first met Akomfrah in '83 at a conference in London, and I met Homi Bhabha and Rashid Areen at the same time, and that's significant in many ways. These are an artist and a theorist who have helped to define, post-colonial studies, post-colonial perspectives. But as a result of anti-racism in 70s Britain, there were many people from India, Pakistan and Bangladesh who identified as black. That didn't last forever. By the late 1980s, the influence of Islam, especially on younger British Asian kids, made it a thing of the past. But it's a point that Stuart Hall made, that if you no longer think of black as biologically determined, but as a product of discourse, you can see how it can be unfixed from its meaning in racist discourse and re-articulated, which is what happened in Britain. And Homi Bhabha and Rashid Areen wouldn't have been at this conference if they didn't have some identification with that term. So, 1983 was about 30 plus years ago. It's a long time ago. But I think it's worth bearing in mind that art can change the climate of opinion. And again, as I was saying just now, it's not that one heroic film changes everything. This is a kind of simplification, again, a cause and effect narrative. But I think that the experimental filmmakers, the collectives like Black Audio and Sankofa, they created a climate of opinion in which there was more skepticism about realism, and that helped to extend the discussion about the role of culture in bringing about social change. Of course, it's not like a program of someone trying to implement an agenda, because these developments are constantly being incorporated back into the cultural industries at the same time. The difference with Godard, I think, is a fairly obvious one that perhaps is worth mentioning. Where is race in Godard's cinema? Okay, there's it's not a question for Godard alone, but for the sort of '68 generation. And I think another way you can put that question into perspective, is to contrast it with Chris Marker. So Chris Marker with Alain Resnais made The Statues Also Die in 1953. And this was commissioned by Alioune Diop, the editor of Présence Africaine. So you have an African editor of a publishing house who's commissioning two white French experimental filmmakers to make a film about the appropriation of African art into Western art museums. And really it's an essay film, it's highly experimental in its montage, that is not widely discussed because it fully understands how important race was, not only to the history of modernism and to the self-image of modern Western countries like France, but how important the whole colonial relationship was. And I think that we see a big contrast with Godard's Maoism in terms of a understanding of the third world that had a blind spot, that didn't take into account Algeria, that didn't take into account France's relationship to Vietnam. And we see a whole generation of leftists, of which Godard is an example, whose identity was framed or formed in large part through that amnesia that I started off talking about.
Bom, eu vou fazer uma última pergunta então, que a gente tem mais um restinho de tempo. E a minha pergunta, como a gente assistiu o filme do Stuart Hall, o Stuart Hall Project, foi a sessão anterior, e eu conversei um pouco com o professor Kobena Mercer sobre a relação, o diálogo entre Akomfrah e Stuart Hall. Eu só queria pedir a ele para comentar um pouco esse diálogo entre
This is another question?
Yeah.
Okay.
The last one.
Okay. Sorry, I always forget.
Que eu queria pedir a você, aproveitando que eu comentei aqui que a gente tinha conversado hoje mais cedo sobre o diálogo entre Akomfrah e o Stuart Hall, e como a gente passou o filme Stuart Hall Project na sessão anterior, eu queria que você comentasse brevemente esse diálogo, essa relação entre ele e o Stuart Hall, entre o Akomfrah e Stuart Hall.
Okay. Yeah, great question. So, like Akomfrah, I am one of many people whose relationship to Stuart Hall began with an image. I'm 18 years old. You have to remember that in 1978, British television finishes at 12 midnight. There are only 3 channels. I'm insomniac, it's probably because I have exams. And I see a black Jamaican man deliver a lecture on Althusser and Althuserian Marxism. And I was very interested in Marxism myself. And this led me to go to the library and find out all I could about Stuart Hall. So the interesting thing about Akomfrah's relationship with Stuart that resulted in the film is that Stuart was a public intellectual who understood that after 1945 we live in a culture of mass media. You know, before the mid-20th century, it's really Voltaire, Rousseau, that is the image of a public intellectual. It's someone with a pen. And we have the exalted figure of the scribe. We have the printed word since Gutenberg. And Stuart understood that broadcasting, mass media, is not simply an instrument to reach large audiences, because he taught at the Open University, which you don't go into a building. Students use radio and television programs, as well as print materials to complete assignments and get their degrees. But right from the beginning, he understood the importance of making an intervention. So Stuart, in his work in media studies, was always practicing a form of immanent critique. He wasn't an outsider who was denouncing the media, but he saw it as a place of struggle. It's a place where there's an agonism or a contest between different points of view. And he argued that the British left, if it was to have any impact, has to get in there. You have to be present, and you have to take the risk of compromise. You might end up being incorporated by the machinery, but if you stay in a place of purity, which is where many of the avant-garde wanted to stay, then your chance of influencing the struggle for consent is diminished. And so I think this is why Stuart Hall has a global audience. But it's also the very building blocks of the unfinished conversation of the Stuart Hall project. Stuart became very ill in later life, and the composition of a film that's made exclusively of archival material pays homage to the commitment that he made to broadcast media, to the moving image. You know, Stuart Hall's first publication, some of his first publications were with the British Film Institute. This is in 1957, and this is when film was not used at all. It was not even considered as a humanities research topic. So I think it was somewhat avant-garde and ahead of his time that he was so invested in the possibilities of intervening in the media. One last question. Okay.
Abre o microfone.
Acho que tá aberto.
Ah, não.
Não?
Peraí.
Boa noite. Uma pergunta ao senhor. Eu tomei conhecimento do Stuart Hall na faculdade e através de um tema do semestre que era pensar comunicação. E o tema tinha não só o Stuart Hall como uma das referências, como também o pensamento do geógrafo Milton Santos sobre a questão das identidades no mundo globalizado. E daí que juntou Stuart Hall com a questão das identidades e o Milton Santos com a questão do mundo globalizado. Pegando as referências do senhor em relação aos dois, o Akomfrah e o Stuart Hall, o que seria para o senhor pensar comunicação para quem está interessado hoje adentrar nesse mundo do audiovisual?
Okay, that's a tough question. It's a very big one, because film industries tend to monopolize the distribution of film texts. So there are a large number of films produced in the Brazilian film industry, in the Indian film industry, or the Nigerian film industry. They don't circulate through the same networks that are monopolized in the English-speaking world by Hollywood. This is a long-established topic in film studies and media studies, but I think that vertical relationship has really stayed the same through 3 decades of neoliberal globalization. Whether it's possible that more horizontal forms of distribution might arise with, or already in place with the internet and social media is, I think, an important question to look into. Those aren't the platforms that Akomfrah is working in. He's working in the gallery now. But I think your question is best applied to thinking about how YouTube or social media may have subverted that vertical relationship that has monopolized the channels of communication.
Pessoal, acho que eles têm que terminar, tá no horário aí. Muito obrigado.